Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Rebooting. Today's guest is someone who is a phenomenal friend to me, an amazing speaker, and she is one of the chief security advisors at Microsoft. She is an absolutely amazing fountain of knowledge on incident response, and you'll probably recognize her from Rebooting Resilience. I'm of course talking about Sarah Armstrong-Smith. Welcome, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. What an introduction that was. Wow.
Do you miss Alysia in your life? I think that's the question a lot of people
I don't know if anyone could really miss Alysia, if I'm honest. She's a force to be reckoned with, isn't she?
She is.
I banged my head a few times on the table.
I think she's in charge of the track and trace system now for the NHS. So
it wouldn't surprise me. You could probably do quite well there.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the first questions I ask all my guests is, how would your family describe what you did for a living?
I probably think most of them would look at you with a blank face, if I'm honest. I literally don't think they know. They think it's some kind of dark art that I'm involved with half the time.
Like some sort of witchcraft that you're doing in your office by yourself.
I think so, because I'm always kind of in the wrong places at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time, however way you want to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, that brings us on very nicely to our topic of today, which is talking about incidents.
Yeah.
And so our viewers are aware, we're going to split this into kind of two parts, because I think there's two really interesting parts to why incidents happen and kind of how we handle them. And the first part, I think, is about, why do they happen in the first place? What sort of risks are we taking and pressures are we sort of falling to that mean that these things come into fruition? And there are a couple of sort of older cases that are sort of literally and metaphorically explosive that I want to kind of talk through with you and get your opinion on. The first one I want to sort of bring up is the Challenger disaster, which was the space shuttle orbiter that blew up 73 odd seconds after liftoff. And I think one of the questions I want to ask, and this will link into the second part as well, is one of the things that they talk about in the report following this incident was that the pressure to launch was so great on NASA at the time, and they were so close to the actual launch. They were hours away from the actual time that they were going to launch. Do you think that pressure, when you're so close to doing something, means that you're more likely to take risks?
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about something which is in the public eye, but also how much money potentially you're spending on a particular thing. And I think when you're looking at risk and you're looking at what to do and how to do it, you're probably going to look for things that actually reinforce your own opinion. So you're actually, when you're thinking about your hypothesis, you're thinking about how much risk and when do I make a decision? Is that decision right? You're looking for things that reinforce your own behavior, your own knowledge, your own thought process, as opposed to something that necessarily is going to challenge that. Mm-hmm. So I think you get into that kind of habit, I think, of almost, as I say, sort of reinforcing something you already believe to be true.
Yeah.
Rather than, and I think actually when it's in the public domain as well, there's a lot of pressure, but not just pressure from from NASA. There's pressure from government, there's media, there's so much attention going around those things that you almost kind of back yourself into a corner, I think, particularly with that type of incident and what was going on at the time as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this kind of brings me on to my next question, which was one of the things that sort of happened. Obviously, we know that it was a seal on a rocket booster that exploded essentially, and they kind of knew from other launches that they'd come close to that happening. And I wonder how much, and I'm keen to get your opinion on this, how much the past ones that were, let's call them near misses, that never went into a full explosion or catastrophic kind of event, does that then make you sort of raise your bar of what safe is from where your sort of zero tolerance of risk might be initially to now we're going to see that as the baseline?
I think it's a really good point with regards to near misses. And I see it so many times. There's so many warning signs, so many opportunities that you've had to actually fix the problem. But I think people get into this false sense of security, literally, because they think it's near miss. And it kind of reinforces again the whole principle of what we were saying. But I think as well, there's so many different parameters that come into play. And I think you look at, they might model a specific threat scenario, but actually there's so many other things at play. And when you think about the weather, and when you think about any external forces that are going on, and those external opinions and all of those things combined, each change actually changes the design of the original kind of whole premise of what we're trying to do. So I think when you have these near misses, I think it means that it reinforces the fact that people are prepared to take more risk as a result of that, as opposed to less risk.
Yeah. And I think it's very easy to criticize the decisions that were made that lost, that caused the loss of 7 astronauts. It's very easy to say, oh, that was completely, unreasonable and you shouldn't have done it. But if you think about it in the sort of context of cyber, and let's say you would come really close to making this application that was going to be used for your company, and the comms team had been putting out press releases about how amazing this was going to be, and literally on the eve of the launch, you find a security flaw in that, and you recommend to your CEO that you're going to delay the launch of this app for 8 months. Do you really think that the CEO is going to go, yeah, that's fine, that's totally responsible?
Well, it's a cultural thing, isn't it? That's what you've just sort of said. And it's that almost because you've already predicated that you are going to launch no matter what. Because you've already set in stone that is going to happen on that particular day. So I would almost sort of question the fact, how much testing, how much work was actually done in advance of that. So you shouldn't even be launching a date for a launch without having actually done all of those pre-checks. But I think, as you were just pointing out, I think hindsight is a wonderful thing. And there's a thing called isomorphic learning as well, which is your ability to learn from kind of situations or scenarios that may look completely different. So actually, if you've seen something like this that's happened before in a completely different situation, what can you learn from that? But I think we have just as an industry, and I don't mean just from cybersecurity, I mean in general terms, we have a real problem with learning lessons and actually taking on board those lessons, and then thinking about how do we actually need to change any of our processes and things that surround that. But we also we just keep reinforcing the same decisions, the same process, the same cultural change all the time. Yeah.
And I think in some ways this brings us on to the next case, which was a similar setup in many ways, actually. And this, when I was a child, and obviously most people who grew up in Europe will have been very familiar with Chernobyl. And actually, my school did a program where we had kids from Chernobyl who kind of did this exchange program. So I actually still have contact with a lot of these kids who are from there. And one of the things that I think is really crucial, there's 2 really interesting points again here. One was this safety test that they were meant to be carrying out, and the fact that they were so close to this completion of this safety test, which would have been brilliant, meant they pushed those boundaries again. And instead of pulling the plug, which they probably all knew they should have done, they thought, oh, it's only a few hours, we can probably be okay, we'll probably make this happen. Which was the first mistake. But the mistake I really want to kind of pull out of this is that one of the things that I think was really crucial was actually in the identification of what had happened at the time, because one of the issues they had was that some of the testing kits, the Geiger counters that measured the radiation in the plant, only went up to a very small number, 3.6 Ronkin, which was very, very small. And it reached 3.6, and they reported that the radiation was 3.6. But obviously, the scale didn't go further. So how important is it that you grasp exactly what's happened? Because obviously in that situation, they saw 3.6, they reported up the chain 3.6, and then the rest of the plan that happened was accordance to that level of radiation, which was obviously completely wrong.
Yeah, I think you've got a really important thing there. So we always sort of talk about you can only make a decision based on the information available at the time of the incident. Now, if that information is flawed, your decision is flawed. And I think we see this a lot with regards to that's a company in the government or any of these things that we're talking about. When we're talking about risk, and we're talking about actually how you report risk and how you actually talk around the impact of some of these things, a lot of the things get washed down. So actually, what is known on the ground versus what is known at the top, and when those decisions are being made, is completely different half the time. And I think that's the challenge, because if that information, as I say, is missing or flawed, your decision that you make, and every decision that you make from that point forth, is also wrong, is also flawed, because you're making it based on incorrect or biased information. And I think that's what we sort of see is if you look at, after every major incident, there's normally some kind of public inquiry, and you can look at these reports, as you sort of say, and you almost see a chain reaction, as we just talked about. And major incidents like this don't just happen. They don't just happen from nowhere. And even when we think about technology, servers don't just fail, technology does not just break. There's normally been a catalyst of things that have led up to that point. And I think even with like Chernobyl, there has been a history of, issues around safety and safety protocols and testing. But as you sort of said, if your Geiger counter if your level of risk only goes to a certain point, and you've got no way of extrapolating that risk, you've got no way of understanding what's the worst possible case scenario. And I see this time and time and time again. Even when my career started 20 odd years ago from a business continuity perspective, and we always talk about worst case scenario, but people and companies will never ever go right to the edge, right to the edge of whatever their worst case scenario. And you almost kind of have to go, and you have to go way, way, way beyond that. But people go to their comfort zone, and they'll do what they know and what they feel comfortable with. And they give that false sense of security that if we have a major incident, don't worry about it, we'll be back up in hours, it's all sorted, happy days. Let's just get on with it.
Right. And I think it's kind of also interesting, because I think when you're thinking about an incident like you and I are here, we're not in an incident, we're not in a crisis, we're calm, we don't have adrenaline, we're thinking clearly, all our cognitive processes are working at a relatively optimal level. It is early, we haven't had all our coffee. But in a crisis, you don't think like that. So it's all well and good saying, well, it was obvious you needed to check X, Y, and Z when you're cool and calm. But when you're in that moment, if you don't have a checklist of things you need to do, I'm not sure even I would execute everything flawlessly. I think I would make mistakes.
Yeah, because again, you're under that pressure, aren't you? And you've got people who are trying to make a decision and do those things at the time. But also, the other thing I think as well, a lot of companies will also have just one set rule, or one set playbook, one set checklist. And if anything deviates away from that, because actually, although we have similarities in incidents, every single one of them is different in terms of the catalyst, what changed, what's the impact, and those type of things. And I think the problem is people get into a really rigid state with a scenario, and then something will come in left field and knock that kind of whole trajectory off path. And then they can't think about what they're supposed to do, what's plan B, what's plan C, what's plan D, E, F, or G. So I think, therefore, we have to have a level of flexibility in our approach to what we do. But the other thing I see as well is when you were talking about, you raise issues, you raise risk, you raise all of these things up and up and up and up until it kind of hits one person. So whether that's like a CEO, it might hit an incident commander, it could be, any one of those people. But they are not experts in every field. So actually you rely and you employ people based on their expertise. So you actually need the people in the know. So whether those are like the supervisors, the experts in those fields, to be able to make a sound recommendation up, not just kind of feed the information up and hope somebody somewhere will make a decision. Because each time that information goes up, it gets changed.
Right, exactly. And I think one of the things that you just pointed out a few moments ago about learning lessons, and I think one of the, I suppose it is unfortunate, but the incidents that involve loss of life always end up with a public inquiry, which means we always end up with some sort of investigation into what happened. So in that respect, we can learn a lot of lessons from those incidents in a way that we can't with incidents that don't involve loss of life, which is sort of a benefit in an unfortunate way, I suppose. And I suppose one of the things I want to talk about, one of the recent inquiries here, was the Grenfell Towers incident. So some of our viewers from the US might not know exactly what happened. So if you could just kind of briefly outline what happened and then some of the main lessons that we can learn from that.
Yeah, so in essence, it was a high tower block, residential block of flats, which was, there'd been a fire that had started in one of the flats. And that's not unusual. We would expect normal fires and you'd have fire breaks and those type of things. But actually, one of the things that actually accelerated the fire and caused that fire to have such a massive impact was the fact it was cladded. And that cladding was not fire resistant, and the fire managed to get in the gaps, if you like, between the actual building and the cladding. So the fire actually went completely round the building. And most of the thought process at the time was around, if you're in a high-rise building, there should be enough of a safety gap within the your own individual apartment. So the safety the principle is stay where you are. And that's sort of, people were ringing up and they were kind of talking about, there's a fire, there's a fire, there's a fire. And all of the people were being told to stay where you are because there's help coming. But what the people couldn't see was actually the fire was starting to engulf around the building. And there's lots of smoke and those type of things. But actually what happened was a big disconnect, I think, just with regards to the changes that had happened in that building. Some of the training or lack of training that had occurred within the fire brigade with regards to how to deal with evacuation of a building of that size and that magnitude, but also with regards to the changes in this cladding of the building. And there had been instances of previous fires that had happened regarding this. And I think there was a kind of a disconnect between the people who were calling in and reporting what was actually going on the ground versus what the incident commanders were seeing. You know, there was a disconnect with like what was being seen on television. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, what we could see was absolutely devastating. But for the people in the building who couldn't see it, because the fire was, a lot of it was ravaging internal into the building. And that just kind of it catalyst from there, really. And it's just kind of one of those incidents where, if you look at like Chernobyl, if you look at, as you say, the Challenger incident, you look at Grenfell, 9/11, these are kind of major incidents that are being put across the television. And it's absolutely shocking to see these things. And I think, therefore, when you kind of see something of that magnitude, and you say there's a loss of life, there's always going to be major questions that get asked of a lot of these things, and obviously public inquiries and those type of things. But I think as well, whenever I see a lot of these major incidents, we're too quick to try and blame people. Mm-hmm. And actually, even when you look at a lot of these things and when you actually look backwards, it's not the people that failed, it was the process that failed. So you can say there's lack of training, there's lack of communication, there's lack of knowledge with regards to some of the changes that have happened. But as we're sort of saying, every time you introduce a change, the design of that building or the design of the IT system or whatever that has happened has also changed. So if you haven't communicated that, people's knowledge is still based on something that happened, you know, X times before. And therefore it's really important that, you know, when we talk about that training, that testing, that knowledge sharing and everything, it has to be continuous. It can't be something that we did X months ago and still expecting that to be the same.
Yeah. And I think one of the other questions I kind of wanted to pick your brains over was, let's sort of bring this back to cyber now for a moment. Let's say you've got this amazing plan for a cyber attack or a data breach or whatever scenario, you've got your playbook written out, everything's perfect. How important is it that your staff and whoever, your CMT, whoever's handling the incident, has the flexibility to deviate from that? Because as you said, the chances of it happening exactly how you've planned out are probably zero or next to zero. So how much freedom do we want to actually give the people who handle the incident?
Yeah, I think it's really important to actually have a set of guidelines and things, sort of priority actions that must happen in a particular order. And I think it's therefore really important also that we also plan for the effect, not the cause.
Mm-hmm.
Every cause is different. But if the cause of the incident has led to an incident that's affecting people, it's affecting technology, then we can actually plan for the effect of that. But I would say number one priority in every single incident, no matter what that incident is, has to be people. We have to put people first and the safety of people above everything. And I even think that also extrapolates into cybersecurity, because I think too often we forget there's an end person at the end of a lot of technology. So I mean, we think about, when we think about Experian, we think about some of these data breaches, we'll say, oh, millions of records were breached. But actually those records relate to people. So what's the impact to those individuals as a result of that breach? So is they have identity theft? Have they got problem getting credit? Are they being impersonated? There's all sorts of things that happen to those people. But it's a kind of like, it almost, we come to the point where we see cybersecurity as a victimless crime. So unlike a physical crime, something you can see that's in front of your face, it's all digital, it's all behind the scenes. We don't actually get to see the end impact of a lot of the things that were going on.
Right. And I think it's quite interesting because it's victimless, but the other side of a cyber incident that I sort of feel like there is some empathy for an explosion or a hospital fire or whatever, any of those sorts of incidents. We might sort of attribute some blame to the organization, but largely we'll sort of feel very empathetic towards them. Can we help in any way? Can we crowdfund for people, whatever? But if you look at like you said, other cyber attacks, like let's take Ashley Madison, for example, their victims of their data breach are being targeted already again by phishing emails and other things like that. How much sympathy did we have for Ashley Madison or for Ashley Madison's users? Zero, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're putting the blame onto the individuals, into the users, aren't you? Because you kind of sort of saying, oh, well, they're having extramarital affairs, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, so who cares? Who so what? But as we know, that had absolutely devastating impact to those individuals. I know people committing suicide, people getting divorced and all that kind of thing. But I think as well, when we think around a lot of this information and data, and particularly when we're talking about what's available on the internet, things are never really 100% deleted. So things have a habit of coming back. And I think that's something we talk around about, that kind of oversharing that we have on social media and the amount of information that's put out there, particularly by sort of younger people and teenagers and that kind of thing. And it's just and even though you think you've deleted it, you think you've removed things, that they just keep reappearing. And it can, so that on itself can cause quite a devastating impact to people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of brings me on to my final couple of questions, which was about communications, public communications. Now, obviously, if you've watched Rebooting Resilience, you'll have seen exactly how not to do it under any circumstances. If you haven't watched that episode, go and check it out, because it's a definite example of how not to do it. But one of the things that NASA has as a kind of strategy is when an incident happens, they have a phrase that they say, lock the doors, and they cut off communications from the incident room, from the mission control room. They lock the doors of the mission control room so staff can't go in and out, and they work out what's happened before they put their communication strategy out. Now, I've got two questions. Firstly, there is a temptation, and we've seen this a lot in cyber incidents, to stay quiet and not say anything for quite a long period of time. What would you say to people who are maybe contemplating that or even have that in their plans?
No, don't do that. I think we're in a kind of this sort of era of trust. So we expect our consumers, we expect people to have trust in us and what we're doing. So you have to be open, you have to be transparent, and you have to do that as quickly as possible. So the challenge is you want to be transparent, but you also have to be careful not to jump the gun too early, because you don't want it to appear like you're not in control of the situation. So you have to kind of gather some facts first with regards to what has happened, what's going on, and you won't have all the facts facts at the time. But you have to be open and transparent, because again, every time we see these things happen, and if it has then gone to the point where there's been some kind of investigation or something like that, it's going to come out that you hid a lot of this information. So I think that being transparent and building a trust is absolutely critical, particularly in those early stages of an incident.
Yeah. And does that apply also to ransom payments? Because I think there is this kind of, sometimes you see companies have this knee-jerk reaction where they'll say, we're not going to pay the ransom, we're not going to pay the ransom. And then they go quiet and suddenly get all of their data back. Or you see a situation where they just don't say anything about it and magically get all of their data and systems back and don't explain what happened. What do you think about that sort of communication strategy? Because it's really difficult, right? Because ransoms potentially, from a business perspective, that may be your best way of getting your business back online. From a moral perspective and from a kind of law enforcement and community perspective, it's a terrible idea. So
I think it's important, first of all, you're dealing with cyber criminals, and extortionists. So even if you were to pay a ransom, there's no guarantee that you're going to get that information back. And also there's no guarantee they're not going to come back for more. So actually you're just fueling the situation. So we have to cut them off at the knee. So the harder and more difficult we make it for cyber criminals to be able to actually get any monetary value out of any of the things that they're doing, we kind of turn them off to a certain extent. There's no return on them doing a lot of these things. So, I mean, I know it's easy to say never pay a ransom, but that really should be the kind of the crux of it. And then that comes back to, therefore, if we assume compromise and if we assume that we are going to have a breach of our data, and that could lead to some kind of extortion like ransomware, it could be published, all of those things. What do we have to do, A, to prevent that from happening in the first place, and B, to make sure that we can actually recover as quickly and as effectively as possible? And if you are in that situation, as we sort of said, that really it's important therefore to communicate what's going on, but also bring the authorities in, lean on experts, because that's what they're there for, to help you in that situation. And I think it's one of the things I love about the community and industry that we work on is actually there is so much help. There is so much capability, and we can just sort of see, even with some of the recent events that we've seen, in the news, there's that kind of rallying around, so you're never really on your own. So there's always help, there's always assistance with regards to what to do and how to do it. So I would always advocate never pay. But as you sort of say, in that situation that people feel like they're under pressure, but all you're doing is just reinforcing the whole situation, and that propensity that next time they'll go bigger, they'll want more, and you're in this perpetual cycle.
Yeah. And as you said, you're not fixing the situation, you're feeding into it, and it's going to come around potentially to bite you again in, a year, 2 years, whatever, down the line. Well, that's all we've got for time for, and I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, and we've kind of covered quite a broad range of topics, from space shuttles to nuclear reactors to, tower blocks, and then ransomware. So, we do the whole thing here on Rebooting, which is really thorough. Where can people go to check out what you're doing and sort of read more about the stuff you're doing and the talks you do and things like that?
Yeah, I'm available on Twitter and also on LinkedIn.
And the links to Sarah's profiles are going to be in the description. So if you want to go and follow her, you can do so there. And don't forget to like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more episodes of Rebooting. Thank you very much for coming on, Sarah. And we'll speak soon.